The Seahawks have gone throughout OTAs with just two quarterbacks on the roster, but that won't be the case heading towards mandatory minicamp and training camp with another veteran joining the fold. We're going to be breaking it all down here on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on Blue Friday by my co-host, Nick Lee. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in, whether you're in Nick's land of the woods in Tumwater, Washington, or near my hometown of Fort Wayne, Indiana. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. OTAs wrapping up officially today for the Seattle Seahawks. They're going to have a new quarterback that's going to be on the field next week, pending physical. We're going to be diving into that reported signing. We'll continue our 90-man countdown numbers 81 through 79, another trio of undrafted rookies that'll be battling for a roster spot with the Seahawks. And as we do each and every Friday, we'll be playing a fun game to round things up, looking at some 2024 related topics for the Seahawks and the NFL. Without further ado, let's get to it. Now for your lead story here on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It's abnormal for teams to go into training camp with only two quarterbacks, but up to this point, the Seahawks have just had Geno Smith and Sam Howell taking all the reps throughout OTAs after Chad Cordero was released. The undrafted rookie Siobhan Cordero, out of San Jose State was released in rookie minicamp. They haven't had any other quarterbacks on the roster. That will no longer be the case pending physical. That's the thing. This is not 100% official at this point, but PJ Walker, the veteran quarterback, is expected to sign with the Seahawks. He and Seattle have agreed to terms. He needs to pass his physical. It is possible, based on what I've been told, that that deal could be announced as early as today, but it could last up till Sunday. They're going to be bringing him in. He's going to have that physical done. He's going to sign his contract, and then Seattle will have to make a corresponding roster move. But, Nick, this should not come as a surprise at all because the Seahawks needed to have a third quarterback. You don't want to go into training camp with only two quarterbacks. Geno Smith, even in a new offense, he is not going to be playing that many snaps in the preseason. Sam Howell is somebody that you view highly for the future. And even though you want to see a lot of him in the preseason, you don't want him playing the whole game, the entire preseason. You need to have a third quarterback on the roster. So the addition of Walker makes sense on a number of fronts.
It does. I mean, this seems, maybe not PJ Walker specifically, but it did seem inevitable that the Seahawks were going to take another quarterback to get to three. So, I mean, PJ Walker, certainly a familiar name. As you can see there, he's got some history in the NFL. He's played in 21 NFL games, thrown, I think it was 339 passing attempts in the NFL, had a really nice, brief XFL career as well. I believe he led the league in passing. So you could certainly do a lot worse than PJ Walker for a third string quarterback. He played for the Browns last year, and I know it says officially 2 starts, but it kind of turned into 3 starts really. And then the Browns went 2-1 in those games. Obviously, some of that was in spite of him, and he made some plays too. But obviously, the biggest concerns for him were the turnovers. He averaged just almost but last year, almost 2 turnovers per start. Had 5 interceptions and 2 fumbles lost last year. So, and then of course the 5'11" height. So that's kind of why he's not really been a guy that's going to get a lot of starts, a lot of looks at starting. But yeah, definitely in the preseason, definitely a guy that can be at worst a camp body to get you through the preseason, and or at worst for the Seahawks, a guy that can make a spot start. That could also be an at worst scenario. Hopefully that doesn't come to that. But I do, like I said, I don't know how many third string quarterbacks the NFL teams have right now with 20 plus games, 300 plus passing attempts in the NFL under their belt. So the Seahawks could do a lot worse than PJ Walker, and it'll be nice to see a somewhat competent quarterback at the number 3 spot in the preseason.
From my understanding, Walker's been a quarterback that's been on Seattle's radar for quite some time, even going back to when he was in the XFL. As you mentioned, that unfortunately shortened season due to COVID. He had 15 touchdown passes and only 4 interceptions, and the Roughnecks went 5-0 with him as the starting quarterback that year. They were on track to dominate that league in the inaugural season. Unfortunately, we saw what happened with COVID and they had to cancel the rest of the season. There's been a couple different reincarnations now of the XFL that we've seen in the last couple of years, but Walker turned that into an opportunity in Carolina with his former college coach, Matt Rule. He was with the Panthers for 3 years, was with the Bears in training camp last year, then got cut. Browns had the injuries at quarterback to Deshaun Watson and ended up bringing PJ Walker in then, and he started a couple games, including against the Seahawks, a game that, quite frankly, I felt like Cleveland was the better team for most of that game. And unfortunately for Walker, the turnover issues, the second pick, the one that bounced off Jamal Adams' helmet, sometimes you just got to pat the other team on the helmet in this case and say, hey, luck was on your side this time. But he made some plays in that game. He threw for almost 300 yards against the Seahawks in that game. He does have some improvisation skills, which as a third-string quarterback, that's something that can help you in a spot start. So the touchdown interception numbers, the completion percentage numbers are not where you want to see a quarterback that's starting games in the NFL, but he can run some. He actually was a kick returner originally coming into the league with the Indianapolis Colts before they put him back at quarterback. So there's a lot to like about him. And this is how I view this, Nick. The Seahawks, they're not going to be bringing PJ Walker in to battle Sam Howell for that second quarterback spot. And it's certainly not going to be battling with Geno Smith. But this does give you a player with the new rules where you can have an extra quarterback that is on your game day active roster for 47 players. You can use him in that capacity if you want to have three quarterbacks. We've seen more teams do that since that rule was implemented last year. Or at minimum, you could have a guy in your practice squad that is able to jump right up. He knows how to handle such a situation. He's already done it a couple times in his career where he's been thrust into a starting role because of injuries. It's never a bad thing to have that kind of depth. So this, to me, is as good of a signing as you're going to be making here. We were joking yesterday on KJR, maybe Seattle can keep signing a bunch of veteran quarterbacks that they beat last year that are still free agents. Ryan Tannehill is still out there, so maybe they'll continue to go that route. But joking aside, I think that this is a really solid addition for them to add to the roster right now that maybe could be on your 53 if you want to keep three quarterbacks. At worst, he can be a guy that you can stash in your practice squad.
Yeah, again, the needle doesn't go very far either way. He did lead the NFL in turnover where they play percentage last year. Again, there's certainly some concerns there. But again, that is why he is clearly the number 3 here in Seattle. But again, I also reiterate that you could do a lot worse at number 3 with quarterbacks. I mean, we were talking – a couple of years ago, we were talking ourselves into, like the Alex Magoo's of the world for quarterback number 3. So going from that to PJ Walker, again, you can do a whole heck of a lot worse. So hopefully we won't see him, of course, and into September, October later, but in camp and in preseason, he'll be fun to watch.
Yeah, so they'll go into mandatory minicamp next week, assuming this deal gets done today or the next few days. They will go into minicamp next week with 3 quarterbacks, which I'm telling you, watching training camp practices, it's critical to have a third quarterback because you do not want Geno Smith and Sam Howell throwing the ball the entire practice. You want to have a third quarterback, and it's not going to be a ton of reps, but you want to have a third QB that can jump in and give those guys a little bit of a spell as well. And in the preseason game, you want to have a third quarterback that you can have in there, mainly so that your top 2 don't get hurt in a game that doesn't count in the standings. So this is an important signing. Seattle will have to make a corresponding move because the roster will be one above the limit. So they'll have to make a move. We'll see what they end up doing. I would assume it's undrafted real out of the depth chart at another position, but they will have to make a corresponding move to get PJ Walker on the roster. When we come back next, we're going to continue our 90-man countdown numbers at 81 through 79, another trifecta of undrafted rookies that we'll be taking a look at it. Maybe a few players that have legitimate prospects for making this football team as well. Don't go away. You're listening to the Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is what brings home the winning trophy, and it also keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors is everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether it's superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, steering wheel covers, whatever you're into, whether it's speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And thanks to eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time and your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're going to be burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the most valuable player and bring home the victory. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. You're listening to the Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It's your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, on our Friday episode by my co-host, Nick Lee, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We've got mandatory minicamp coming up this next week. Those 3 days, another critical phase for all players on the roster, especially the undrafted rookies. You want to continue to make a strong impression on the coaching staff before the 6-week break between minicamp and training camp. And Nick, continuing our 90-man countdown, we've got 3 intriguing undrafted rookies that we're going to be discussing here. And starting off at number 81, we know Seattle's running back situation. Ken Walker III, Zach Charbonnet, those are your clear 1-2 punch. Kenny McIntosh, probably the number 3 running back, though I believe George Halani, the undrafted rookie out of Boise State, could push him for playing time. And if Kobe Lewis, the undrafted rookie out of Florida Atlantic, can rediscover his 2019-2020 form before he had a nasty knee injury, maybe, just maybe, Kobe Lewis could be in the mix here, because I'm looking back at my notes at some running backs that I watched 3 or 4 years ago, and Kobe Lewis was actually on my NFL draft peripheral when he was at Western Michigan, and unfortunately had that nasty injury, and he just hasn't been the same player since. But you're talking about a guy that's got kick return experience. There is evidence of him being a dynamic runner, and he tested pretty well. So maybe this is a player that isn't getting any publicity that could potentially be a Troy Maine-Pope type player once we get to training camp.
Well, Corbin, I do worry because, 2019, that in running back years, that feels like the Vietnam War era. I mean, it just feels so long ago. I know that a lot of things in the world have happened since then that kind of makes it feel that way. But yeah, obviously past 1,000-yard rusher. He kind of reminds me, Corbin, I'm going to forgive my baseball analogy, but that power hitter that all of a sudden, breaks his wrist or has a forearm strain or something like that, just nags him. And you can see, in his career where his power just gets completely sapped because of those injuries. Like the wrist and the forearm aren't as strong. He goes from a 35 home run hitter to, 15 to 20. And it just completely tanks. You've seen some of the better sluggers, when they age, that kind of happens. I'm getting those kind of vibes, honestly. Where, yeah, back then it was absolutely there. Absolutely, if he enters the 2020 draft here, it's probably going to happen, but probably not here. So, he'll get some carries in the preseason, I imagine, but I do worry about his durability and some of the power that was sapped. Can he still hit 25 homers, so to speak? Can he still get to somewhat of where he was back then? But I do worry about where he's been since that injury.
Yeah, and that is a long time gap. We're talking about 4.5 years since that injury, and he just hasn't been the same player. He's played at a couple different schools. He was at Purdue for a year as a backup, didn't do much, average under 4 yards per carry, then goes to Florida Atlantic, and he had a decent final season, but he wasn't the dog. He wasn't the workhorse. He hasn't been that player. The other concern I have is there's just not much evidence of him being a pass catcher or a solid pass protector. And if you're wanting to make a football team as one of the last running backs on the roster, you have got to be able to do those things. So on one hand, the special teams ability, in the past, at least there was some kick return talent there. I don't know if he's going to get a look there or not. But the fact that he has not had great success in pass protection, limited production as a receiver, those are things that are concerning. But again, if he goes out and he runs like he did a few years back before that injury in training camp, maybe he ends up being a player that goes on the right side of the bubble, or at least becomes a practice squad player. Now let's go to the guys that are going to be opening up lanes for Kobe Lewis and the rest of Seattle's running backs. And I think everybody assumes that Nick Harris and Olu Oluwatimi are going to be the 2 centers for the Seattle Seahawks. I would be stunned if there's somebody else that's on this roster, but you don't often have a guy like Mike Nowitzki, who has 6 years of college starting experience, that comes into the NFL. And Kansas had one of the most potent offenses in college football last year. One of the reasons they were able to do it without their starting quarterback for a big chunk of the season was their offensive line, which was led by Mike Nowitzki, who's got a lot of experience. I think he's a player that's more athletic than his athletic testing numbers showed, at least on film. And yet at the same time, you're also looking at a guy, you got to wonder, is he a high floor, really low ceiling guy at this point, because he is a much older rookie at the center position.
Yeah, I'm fairly familiar with his game. Just a lot of BYU players had cleat marks on the back of their jerseys from him and the Kansas offense when I was watching them against BYU. And certainly he's one of the more experienced. I was looking at his Pro Football Focus page, almost 3,500 snaps in his college career. Just a voluminous career. He's probably my favorite of these three we're going to talk about. I don't know necessarily that it's one of the three that have the best chance of making the team. In fact, it might be the worst. But just with Nick Harris as a serviceable backup center, he allowed just 3 pressures and 0 quarterback hits and 169 pass blocking snaps last year as a backup center. So that's some stiff competition, I think, for Nowitzki. And it's not exactly the same kind of situation, or the Harris and Olu situation isn't exactly as, in cement as Evan Brown and Olu were last year. So Nowitzki might be able to enter that fray, but really that's a pretty, I'd say it's a fairly sizable gap. It's certainly an NFL experience, NFL, size and readiness there with the top 2, and then Nowitzki here. But, with a strong preseason, he should get a lot of looks there at center in preseason. Maybe he can show some versatility at guard as well. I mean, they can maybe find a spot for him at worst at practice squad, and maybe sit around, wait for an injury, which, does happen along the offensive line. I don't think this is certainly a guy that the Seahawks or fans should give up on so quickly, just even though he's, third string center. Here we are talking about the third string center, Corbin. And I'm saying, don't, remember that name. Don't quite stash away Mike Nowitzki quite yet. I do think that we're going to mention him again sometime in the next few months.
And the last couple of years, they've had Joey Hunt on the practice squad so that they had an extra center that was available. And there's not a lot of evidence of this guy being able to play guard. So I don't know if that's going to be something he's going to be able to do. But practice squad is definitely a possibility if he's able to have a strong preseason and training camp. Going to be an uphill battle, though, for him to have any chance of making this football team. The last player we're going to talk about here, though, I don't feel the same about. And it's because of the depth and talent concerns at linebacker. We don't know the situation with Jerome Baker, the wrist surgery he had. Is he going to be ready for training camp? Tyrell Dodson's been extremely limited in OTAs as well. So both the free agents you signed have not been out there on the field. You've had Patrick O'Connell and John Radigan getting all the first-team reps at linebacker. And Tyrese Knight, not quite ready to move him up with the ones, though he has shown some progress on the practice field. Easton Gibbs has been the other linebacker with the second team unit. And there's a lot of things that, when you look on paper working against him. He is short and small. He's 6 foot, 230 pounds. This is not a big linebacker. He's got a leaner lower body, looks like a safety, which is the position he played in high school. His speed is not necessarily great for a player that size, ran in the low 4.7s. But he also had a sub-7-second 3-cone. So he might not be fast, but he's got really good change of direction skills. And Wyoming knows how to kick out linebackers. We saw Chad Muma go to the Jaguars, a second-round pick. We saw Logan Wilson in Cincinnati. He's become one of the best inside linebackers in the NFL. And Easton Gibbs got to play with both of those guys, grew up under them, and then became a starter. 300-plus tackles over the last 3 seasons. He's also got 7 sacks, so he can blitz, and we know Mike McDonald prioritizes that. So this is a player, when I look at the depth that the Seahawks have right now, I can absolutely see Easton Gibbs making this football team.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why Wyoming got maybe the 3rd most screen time in that College Football 25 trailer. It's because they are not devoid of talent, and Easton Gibbs fits that bill. Where there's injury and there's lack of depth, there's opportunity, and I do think there's an opportunity here for Easton Gibbs. And the last few years, I know I've been pretty critical of the center position. That's kind of been my, pound the table. We need to be better at this kind of position. And I'm really excited to see what maybe Olu can turn into at center. So I'm going to kind of stash that away. Linebacker might become my new one. I am pretty out on the situation at linebacker. I'm pretty down on it. Easton Gibbs, I think there's an opportunity there for him. You mentioned, the size is certainly an issue. over 300 tackles the last 3 seasons. I mean, the dude is just a hoover when it comes to tackling, and that's a skill in of itself. I think he had one of the lower missed tackle rates in the FBS last year as well. Like when he
doesn't miss tackles very much.
He doesn't miss tackles. Obviously, the athleticism and the speed is one thing, but when he gets his hands on you, you're going down pretty much. So there's the skill in that too. Given the Jerome Baker's health, Dodson, even if Dodson's healthy, there's still a bit of a wild card scenario, and I still don't know about John Radigan perhaps being a cap casualty. I wrote about Patrick O'Connell. I do like him, and I don't write him off as well. So Easton Gibbs, there's absolutely an opportunity for you. There's a pathway here for you to make the roster.
Especially without Nick Bellore being on this team. You need some guys to step up on the special teams aspect. So I think Easton Gibbs, that is an area that he can really carve out a role on this team. But if he's able to do what he did in the college level, and he is able to find the football, run around the field and just make plays, create some havoc as a blitzer, there's a lot of things that are working in his favor, even if he doesn't fit the typical size or doesn't have that downhill speed that you're looking for necessarily at the position. He plays faster on film, and he's certainly got the change direction skills. So this is a player that I would not discount at all to make this football team. When we come back, we are going to shift to our Blue Friday game day. We're going to play a little bit of what's more likely, looking at a number of Seahawks and NFL topics. Don't go away. You're listening to the Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Blue Friday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined by my co-host, Nick Lee. And a special thanks to all the 12s. Thanks, as always, for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it, as we do each and every Friday, especially this time in the offseason. It's game day here on Blue Friday, and we're going to break out one of our old favorites, one of our standbys. What's more likely? We're going to have 2 different scenarios. And Nick, you and I have to decide which one is more likely to happen. And we're going to be basing this on the 2024 season. A little bit of projection, a little bit of crystal ball here. So let's get to our first one. And I know that you are really excited about this one going into the show. What's more likely? Jackson Smith-Njigba leads Seattle in receptions, or Noah Fant eclipses 800 receiving yards?
Well, I'm going to try to avoid, being the meme of the guy that slowly puts on, clown makeup as he says the tight ends are going to have a big year for the Seahawks, because I feel like that's just going to be, clown makeup again. There seems to be a growing expectation for Jackson Smith-Njigba this year. Year 2. I mean, let's not forget, he was drafted before Jordan Addison. He was drafted before Zay Flowers. Obviously drafted before Puka Nacua. Almost everybody was. But, he's got that pedigree. He's got that talent. And his only really, the only really con against him has been the depth at receiver for the Seahawks. It's nothing he's really done. And I think that he's starting to ascend a little bit more. And you saw last year, he got better pretty much as the year went along. I'm going to go that between these 2 scenarios, it's more likely that Jackson Smith-Njigba leads the team in receptions, because also, Noah Fant hasn't even eclipsed 500 yards with the Seahawks, much less 800 yards. It's been a minute since the Seahawks have had an 800-yard tight end. I believe maybe since Jimmy Graham. I'm just going off the top of my head, so I could be wrong, but it's been a while. So I'm going to go just with the continuing ascent of Jackson Smith-Njigba. While he might not lead him in yards or touchdowns, I think just the way Grubb can scheme it around, get him the ball in space, quick hitting, things like that. I could see those piling up.
This one's really easy for me because, as you mentioned, Noah Fant hasn't even gone over 500 yards. Now, could I see him getting to 600 this year? Absolutely. I think that Ryan Grubb's the coordinator that can make that happen, and that's one of the reasons that they gave the money they did to Noah Fant, because I think Ryan Grubb feels like, hey, I know there's a lot of untapped talent here that we have not been able to get statistics in the last 2 years. Bullish on Jackson Smith-Njigba leading this team in receptions. In fact, I would go as far right now as saying, if I had to predict who's going to lead the team in receptions, I think it is going to be Jackson Smith-Njigba. That does not mean he leads them in receiving yards or touchdowns, as you said, but this is a guy that I think is going to be a high volume target in Ryan Grubb's offense. So to me, this one's really easy. It is much more likely that Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to be leading this team in catches. Our next one, going to the defensive side of the ball. What's more likely? Draymond Jones hits 8 sacks, or Devin Witherspoon leads Seattle in interceptions?
Well, Draymond Jones' career high is 6.5. 6.5 sacks, which he's done twice. Now he's moving to more of a true edge role, so we assume. So I could see him maybe getting to that mark, maybe even to 6 or 7, or maybe even get to 7. 8 seems like a lot, just kind of where his career's gone, and some other tools and weapons that the Seahawks have along the defensive line. Meanwhile, I think Devin Witherspoon is going to lead this team in interceptions, and it might not even be that close. I really do think, Mike McDonald is, he's not getting much sleep these days, but it's not because he's stressed. It's because he's beautiful minding how to get Devin Witherspoon, involved. And beautiful minding is now a verb officially. I just declared it.
You just mixed in what's the word with today's game. Here.
He's got the chalkboard back there, and he's just scheming up ways to just make life absolutely miserable for offenses with Devin Witherspoon. I think that's going to lead. That coupled with, I'm assuming in a bounce back year for Woolen, I think that's going to lead to more opportunities for Witherspoon. So I'm going to go, he leads the team in interceptions. And, it doesn't have to be 6 or 7 interceptions because Julian Love last year led the team with 4. I could see him leading the team with 5 or 6, but I do think that he's going to make that leap in interceptions.
Yeah, you and I are allowed to make adjustments to our predictions as the offseason goes on, but I'm sticking with what I said several weeks ago, that not only is Devin Witherspoon leading this team in interceptions, I think he gets to 6. That's the number that I'm putting out this year. So I think there's a chance both these things could potentially happen if Draymond Jones really hits in this new role that Mike McDonald's going to be using him. But I'm more confident in Devin Witherspoon being that disruptive playmaker on the back end that not only gets a bunch of picks, but also gets you sacks and just does a little bit of everything. That true weapon that you can move all over your secondary. So I'm more confident in Witherspoon doing that. I actually like the odds of both these potentially happening this upcoming season for the Seahawks. Now our next one, more of a team scope here. What's more likely, Seahawks win the NFC West or Seattle earns a top 3 pick in the 2025 NFL Draft?
Well, that's basically asking, will the Seahawks have a better record than the 49ers this year? Or will they kind of, maybe fall down the wayside down the stretch and maybe go 5-12, 4-13. And I'm going to go with a less fun option. Unfortunately, I do think the 49ers are going to be a force again this year. This is not to say the Seahawks are going to go 4-13. I just think statistically, it's probably more likely they do than they go, 13-4 and win the NFC West and, split with the 49ers and or have a tiebreaker over them somehow. I still think they're kind of in that 9-8, 10-7 range as they have been the last few years. I think they got the talent there. That there's varying levels of unpredictability with a new head coach, new regime, but that's pretty spicy. I did think of cheating and say, well, they're going to trade up for the top 3 pick after, no. I thought about that, but
I would have shot that down because that was not an option here.
I know you would have. So I'm going to go. It's more likely they get a top 3 pick than win the division, but that is not me saying I think they're going to be bad. I do think that they can go 10-7, get a wild card spot, make some noise. But as far as these two things happening with the probabilities, I would say they're both fairly low, honestly. But maybe on the less fun side is slightly more likely.
Yeah, and I'm going to go a different direction than you in this one because you mentioned the Seahawks being a 9 or 10 win team in your mind. That's closer to winning the NFC West than it is to being a top 3 draft pick team. True. And San Francisco has a brutal schedule compared to the Seahawks. And I know that only matters so much because it's based off of last year's numbers, which the rosters are much different. But still, it is really hard to stay on top in this league. And so I would say I'm in agreement with you that I think it's a fairly low probability for both of these scenarios, but I would feel much more confident that Seattle can compete for an NFC West championship this year than I would them competing to tank to get a top 3 pick this year. I just don't see that happening unless there's a bunch of injuries or something. I think this team is way better than that. So I'd be much more confident in them competing for a division title. This one's going to be fun. What's more likely, Mike McDonald sports retro Chuck Knox cap 3 or more games, or John Schneider makes 2 trades after the preseason finale?
Oh boy, man, this is this was the hardest one I had, really, because I could see a weird thing happening where if Mike McDonald wears this and something good happens, he can't take it off, kind of like a Pete Carroll hat scenario, where all of a sudden he has to keep wearing it, they keep winning or something like that. But I think John Schneider also can't help himself. I think there are going to be some moves there. So I'm going to go John Schneider, but I would love for both of these things to happen for exciting reasons, of course. But I could definitely see John Schneider making a few moves that would be, I think, the more likely option. But don't sleep on that Chuck Knox hat. I would rock that thing. Don't sleep on that quite yet.
I'm going with the Chuck Knox hat one. I just think Mike Macdonald, he is going to wear a hat every game. There's going to be a different vibe than Pete Carroll. It's his version of Pete Carroll's gum. He has got to have his hat on. And I just have a feeling, based on what he said the other day, wearing that, maybe I'll wear this a little bit more. I think he's going to be donning that blue cap a lot.
Certainly throwbacks.
John Schneider, I could see making a trade, but two, that seems a little rich. So I'm going to go Mike Macdonald this one. Back to football, shall we? What's more likely? Geno Smith throws 31 or more touchdowns, or Jerome Baker tallies 120 or more tackles?
This one was a fun one. Both of them, on the higher end of their career highs. One of these would be a career high, and one of them would not. And so that's where I'm going to kind of go with this. Health willing, Jerome Baker, I think by default will become, if he starts week one, if he's healthy enough to play the whole season, by default, he should get 120 something tackles. I just think, he's probably the off-ball linebacker they have right now. And if he can stay healthy, I think that's probably the biggest, persuader of this question is Jerome Baker healthy enough to play enough to get 120 tackles? But I'm going to go with Jerome Baker. I do think Geno Smith, I think we talked about this either last week or a couple weeks ago. I don't think he's going to get, this high of touchdowns. I do think with the Ryan Grubb system, with the weapons he has, JSN, a year or two, maybe hopefully offensive line that's improved. I do see him going from 20 to like 27, 26, which would still be a great season with all else around the Seahawks. But 31 is pretty rich, I think, for me. It'll be a new career high for Geno Smith. So I'm going to go Jerome Baker just because of sheer volume. He should get health willing.
I predicted Geno Smith was going to throw 32 touchdowns a couple weeks ago in one of the games. So I'm going to go with that. And there's another reason I'm going to pick Geno Smith on this one. I've been saying this, kind of hinting this the last few weeks. I think at some point this year, Tyrese Knight is going to get an opportunity to play for the Seahawks on defense. I think it's going to come sooner rather than later. And the injury situation with Jerome Baker too. Maybe he's going to come into training camp and he's perfectly fine. I don't think it's time to panic on that front, but there's just enough stuff going on there with players behind him, injuries. I am more confident in Ryan Grubb being able to get another breakout season of sorts out of Geno Smith in this offense. So I'm going with Geno Smith going to 31 or more touchdowns in this one. Oh, we're going to the offensive line for the next one. What's more likely? Charles Cross earns a Pro Bowl selection for the first time, or Abraham Lucas starts 15 or more games in 2024?
Well, unfortunately, I'm pretty down on the situation with Abe Lucas. I'm pretty worried. I would honestly be shocked if he starts 15 plus games. I'd be pretty surprised, honestly, if he starts week one. I'd be maybe not shocked, might not be the right word, but I'd be like, oh, okay, good for him. If he starts
wasn't surprised, yeah.
Wasn't surprised, yeah, because it could certainly happen, but I don't know. There's something that makes me a little worried. So that also is asking in this scenario for Charles Cross, because I was looking, there's about 3 or 4 tackles per season per conference for Pro Bowls. So you're basically asking Charles Cross, are you going to be a top 4 left tackle this year in the NFC? And that's a pretty hard ask. But I think of these two scenarios, that is more likely that he does earn a Pro Bowl. I mean, if he plays up to his top 10 pick pedigree, he continues that kind of slow burn. It's been a slow cook with Charles Cross. If it starts to kind of boil over and he becomes, that true, franchise cornerstone tackle, then yeah, I do think that he absolutely has that Pro Bowl potential. So I'm going to go with the Charles Cross Pro Bowl one, just because more so I'm worried about Abe Lucas. But I do think there's something there for Charles Cross to get to that level too.
My heart is saying Abraham Lucas. My brain is saying you've got to go with Charles Cross, because I have a ton of faith in Scott Huff. I love what I have seen so far, and I know it's just OTAs, but I love the dedication to fundamentals and one-on-one instruction and things that we just haven't seen very much of in Seattle with offensive line play. And I think Charles Cross has all the talent in the world to be able to be a top 4 or 5 left tackle in the NFL. And so I am much more bullish on that. I wish I could be more bullish on Abe Blue because I am really concerned about that knee. And I just don't know about 15 starts. That seems like asking a lot with his situation. He might not even be ready for week 1, as you said. We've got a fun one here. What's more likely, Ken Walker and Zach Charbonnet each rush for over 600 yards apiece, or Byron Murphy wins Defensive Rookie of the Year?
This one for me, if I had to pick like what's the likeliest where both come true, this would be my choice, honestly. Like they were 140 yards short for Zach Charbonnet of this happening last year with shoddy run blocking at times and with some systemic issues there. I'm still hot and bothered how the Defensive Rookie of the Year was with Witherspoon finishing 4th somehow. And really, I was looking at the voting. You're pretty much asking, can Byron Murphy have maybe a slightly better season than Jalen Carter had last year? And which I think, 6 sacks, 8 tackles for loss, 9 quarterback hits. I would think Byron Murphy can get to those numbers or better this year if he plays the whole year. And also, just looking at the draft this year, he was the second defensive player taken. He was the second guy taken, and I believe he could have a better season than the first guy in Latu. So the true elite blue chip draft choices at the defensive positions this year weren't as plentiful in the first round. So I think that also is in Byron Murphy's case. So long story short, I'm going to pick Byron Murphy for D-Roy. I think that could happen. I'm not saying, I could say, both of these things happen. Ken Walker the third. I'm going to go, he goes 1,000 yards. Charbonnet gets maybe 500. That's a good combo, but I am all in on the Byron Murphy D-Roy train.
I just don't think he's going to get enough sacks to be able to win that award. And it's unfortunate. I could see him having a very good season, but the sack numbers aren't where they need to be. And somebody like Latu gets more sacks, so he ends up winning the award. I think that the other one, with both running backs getting to 600 yards, I'm saying right now, I'm guaranteeing that it happens. I think that Seattle's offensive line is going to do a better job in the run blocking department. And even though I think Ken Walker III is the starter, Zach Charbonnet runs a lot like Dylan Johnson did at Washington last year. I think his style is going to be something that endears to Ryan Grubb and to Scott Huff as they build the run game there. So I think both these guys get to 600 plus rushing yards. Real quick, Nick, we got a real fun one to wrap things up here. What's more likely? Major transactions stop happening when I stop running, or Nick stops making pop culture references?
The picture, if you're on the podcast and don't see the picture, I'm dying. I'm sorry. Well, to quote Paul Blart Mall Cop, I'll meet you on the corner of Ne and Ver. Never. I will never stop making those pop culture references. So what's more likely to happen? I think, injury concerns with Corbin, perhaps. I don't wish this on you, but I can be a quadriplegic and still make pop culture references. So I'm going to go with it's more likely Corbin that stops, because I will never stop making those references. You blindsided me with that picture. I'm trying to keep my composure.
I gotta go with you and the pop culture references here too, because even though I'm training for a half marathon, like, you think maybe at some point the luck will run out where John Schneider's going to stop spying on when I'm running and the moves are going to stop coming in. I think that's more likely of these two things to happen. I'm going to keep running, but the transaction thing has just been crazy how that's gone. So I'm going to go with you for pop culture on that one as well. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Nick at NickLee51. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back on Monday, it's all about mandatory minicamp. Rob Rang and I will be diving in with a preview on what we're going to be watching on offense, defense, and even some special teams. Enjoy your weekend, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.